General Hospital will reveal Willow had once been revered as a devoted mother and a selfless wife, a figure who inspired admiration through her quiet resilience, unwavering loyalty, and the compassion she brought to every room she entered. But that image, so carefully built over years of love and sacrifice, has now begun to crumble under the weight of exposed truths and misguided decisions. Once viewed as a pillar of maternal strength, Willow now finds herself at the center of public scrutiny and emotional collapse, as her recent choices have left her vulnerable, isolated, and tragically disconnected from the very children she swore to protect. What was meant to be a quiet evening at Carly's home quickly turned into the catalyst for a chain reaction of emotional revelations. As Michael gently ushered Wiley out of the house to spend the night with his grandmother, there was a fragile sense of calm in the air. Amelia, innocent and unaware, remained behind under the care of a trusted babysitter. But it was during this moment of perceived tranquility that Jason, acting under Michael's direction, stepped into the shadows with a singular purpose, to remove Amelia from Drew's custody and deliver her to safety. The babysitter's call to Drew's home ignited a firestorm, and within moments, Willow spiraled into a state of emotional chaos. Consumed by anger and fear, she lashed out, accusing Jason of kidnapping her daughter, completely unaware that the real danger had never been Jason, it had always been the illusion she'd clung to with Drew. At the PCPD, Willow stood beside Drew, visibly shaken and blinded by a misguided sense of righteousness, convinced that her fury would be met with justice. She stormed in, declaring a kidnapping, determined to paint Jason as the villain in what she believed to be an egregious violation of her rights as a mother. But Jason, ever composed, did not flinch. He faced the accusation not with anger, but with clarity and calm, dismantling the narrative with three irrefutable truths that would force both the police and the public to reevaluate the circumstances under an entirely different lens. First, Jason produced documentation showing that his actions were legally grounded. He had acted under the authority of Michael's legal team, who held active medical proxy and custodial rights over Amelia, rights that had not only been established during Michael and Willow's marriage, but also reaffirmed in paperwork that Willow herself had willingly signed during their time together. These were not forged permissions nor desperate loopholes, but legitimate, binding agreements made during a time when Willow trusted Michael more than anyone else. Her signature was the first indictment against her own argument. Second, Jason presented concrete evidence of Drew's dangerous manipulation. Audio recordings, collected over several weeks, revealed Drew discussing the legal strategy of framing Michael as an absentee father. An intentionally distorted narrative designed to win custody battles by painting Michael as neglectful and emotionally unavailable. These recordings were damning, not only because they exposed Drew's true motivations, but also because they highlighted the extent to which he was willing to exploit Willow and the children to achieve his goals. In doing so, Jason proved that his intervention was not reckless, but protective. Amelia had been taken not from her mother, but from a situation rapidly devolving into psychological warfare. The third and final point struck at the heart of the issue, Willow's mental state. Jason spoke plainly, not with cruelty, but with the painful honesty of someone who still cared. He acknowledged that Willow, once strong and clear-minded, was no longer herself. Her recent behavior, erratic decisions, emotional outbursts, blind loyalty to Drew, were symptoms of a woman drowning in trauma and unable to see the consequences of her actions. Jason argued that she had become so entangled in her desperate need for control and emotional validation from Drew that she was now incapable of making decisions in Amelia's best interest. These assertions were not meant to shame her, but to protect Amelia from becoming collateral damage in a custody war fueled by personal vendettas. These three revelations did more than clear Jason's name. They cracked open the veneer of denial that Willow had carefully built around herself. For the first time in months, she was forced to look at her reflection in the cold glass of the interrogation room, not as a mother wronged, but as a mother who had lost her way. The shame was immediate and suffocating. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that her allegiance to Drew had not been born of love, but of need, a need to feel chosen, protected, and empowered after years of quiet suffering. But in that desperate search, she had severed herself from truth, from reason, and from the very family she once fought so hard to preserve. As Jason left the PCPD, legally unscathed and emotionally resolute, the weight of Willow's choices settled on her shoulders like lead. The very man she had accused of betrayal had in fact acted with the integrity and foresight that she herself had long abandoned. It wasn't just that Jason had outmaneuvered Drew. It was that Jason had never stopped prioritizing the children, even when others were blinded by rage, pride, or vengeance. Meanwhile, Willow sat in silence, drowning in the realization that her maternal instincts had been distorted by the illusion of love, and that her pursuit of happiness had led her directly into a storm of her own making. Her fall from grace had not come from one singular act, but from a steady erosion of judgment, trust, and self-awareness. She had forsaken a husband who never stopped fighting for their family, allowed herself to be manipulated by a man more concerned with power than protection, and, in doing so, endangered the very children she swore to shield. The road back from this point would not be easy. Forgiveness, from Michael, from the community, and perhaps most painfully, from herself, would be long in coming. And yet, somewhere beneath the shame and regret, a flicker of clarity remained. Willow, now stripped of illusion, stood at the edge of a reckoning. Whether she would retreat further into denial or rise from the ashes of her mistakes would depend on the choices she made next. But one truth had become undeniable: she had been blind, and now she saw, and what she saw was the cost of choosing the wrong man, at the wrong time, for all the wrong reasons. Willow's rage, once fiery and unrelenting, had transformed into something far more devastating: shame. What once roared in her heart as maternal fury over the loss of her daughter now echoed as a hollow, painful recognition of her own blindness. The very man she had spent weeks demonizing, Jason, a figure she once saw as threatening, cold, and disconnected from the emotional realities of parenting, had acted with more clarity, integrity, and protectiveness than anyone else in her life, including herself. In one shattering moment, everything Willow believed was turned upside down. Jason hadn't stolen Amelia out of malice. He had rescued her from a web of manipulation and deceit that Willow had unknowingly woven around her child by allowing Drew unchecked access to every corner of their lives. This revelation pierced Willow deeper than any accusation could. She had turned away from Michael, a husband who had once stood by her through cancer, grief, and uncertainty. A man who had fought relentlessly to give her the family she never had, who had loved her with fierce loyalty and boundless patience, even when she struggled to love herself. Michael had not been perfect, no one was, but he had never lied about his intentions, never used her vulnerabilities against her, never sought power over her through fear or manipulation. And yet, in her desperation to feel whole again after the emotional wreckage of her illness and the trauma of nearly losing her own life, she had reached for Drew, a man whose steady smile had concealed a dangerous ambition. Drew had presented himself as calm and stable, as the savior she needed in the wreckage of her life. But in truth, he had always been quietly strategic, calculating his moves like a chess player who saw people not as individuals with needs and feelings, but as pieces to be moved and sacrificed in pursuit of the endgame. He had gained Willow's trust slowly, soothing her wounded heart, offering solace in moments of loneliness, until she no longer questioned his intentions. She signed documents in his favor without hesitation. Custody forms, medical proxies, legal declarations that tied her children's future to his hands. She had dismissed those who expressed concern. She ignored Michael's warnings, brushed off Carly's insight, and rejected Jason's subtle but firm interventions. She allowed herself to believe that her critics were simply jealous, petty, or unwilling to let her move on. But now she knew. Now she saw. What cut the deepest wasn't the betrayal itself, but her own willingness to be deceived. Willow, who had once prided herself on intuition and compassion, had become someone who could no longer tell the difference between love and control. She had confused attention for affection, stability for security, and promises for truth. The irony was cruel. Michael, whose only flaw had been loving her too much, had become the villain in her rewritten narrative, while Drew, who had carefully crafted a facade of reliability, had become the hero. And in flipping those roles, she had upended the lives of everyone around her, especially her children. The legal documents she signed with a blind heart now stood as testaments to her misplaced trust. She had handed Drew control of not just her children's futures, but her own. He now held the authority to make medical decisions for Amelia and Wiley, to determine where they lived, and with whom they spent their time. It was an irreversible mistake unless contested in court. A mistake she could no longer justify as mere oversight. It was a betrayal of her instincts, a surrender of her judgment, and worst of all, a dismissal of Michael's role as a father. She had silenced the voice of the one man who had never stopped advocating for their children's well-being, simply because his presence reminded her of her own pain. What made it worse was how easily she had silenced others too. She had pushed away Carly, whose maternal instincts had warned her early on about Drew's intentions. She had rejected Jason's concern, mislabeling his involvement as interference. She had even grown cold toward Sasha, whose gentle guidance had often attempted to bring balance back into her emotional chaos. Each person who dared question her choices had been treated like an enemy rather than a lifeline. And as the fog of self-righteousness lifted, Willow was left alone with the wreckage. Abandoned trust, strained friendships, and legal entanglements that would now require a team of attorneys to undo. It was a cruel kind of awakening, the moment when shame overtook anger and forced her to confront the truth. She hadn't been a victim of manipulation alone, she had been a willing participant. She had let her wounds do the choosing, not her wisdom. She had mistaken need for love and flattery for respect. And in doing so, she had compromised the safety of the very children she claimed to protect. It was not that she had chosen Drew over Michael, it was that she had abandoned her own compass, her own values, and ultimately, her own children's best interests for the illusion of emotional salvation. Jason's decision to remove Amelia, once painted as a hostile act, was now the only action in this entire story rooted in selflessness. He had nothing to gain, no legal victory, no personal reward. He had simply acted as a guardian, stepping in when he saw danger, even if it meant being hated. That act of silent courage now stood in contrast to Willow's desperate grasp for control, and in that comparison, her soul trembled. She was no longer just a woman who had made mistakes, she was a mother who had failed to protect her child from the consequences of her own need to be loved. And now, she faced the aftermath. Courts could reverse documents. Lawyers could undo legal damage. But restoring faith? Rebuilding the trust she had shattered with Michael, with Carly, with Jason, and most tragically, with herself, that was the true mountain she now had to climb. In the quiet of the interrogation room, where her voice once rose with rage, there was now only silence. A silence filled with regret, with recognition, and with the chilling knowledge that sometimes, love isn't enough, especially when it blinds you from the truth. Willow's downfall was more than just the tragic unspooling of a single woman's life, it was a narrative masterstroke that breathed new energy into General Hospital, providing the perfect catalyst to reintroduce Michael Corinthos in a bold, commanding light. Her emotional collapse, once seen through the lens of sorrow and victimhood, became the very mirror that reflected Michael's strength, maturity, and clarity of purpose. As Willow descended into confusion, poor judgment, and ultimately a painful awakening, Michael emerged as the figure audiences could rally behind. This wasn't just about shifting sympathy, it was about transferring emotional ownership of the story from a character unraveling to one rising with purpose. Faced with the challenge of transitioning the role of Michael to a new actor, the writers could have chosen a path of gradual re-entry, allowing the audience to warm up to the new portrayal with soft scenes and background moments. But instead, they leaned into the storm. They pushed Michael directly into the emotional core of the show's most volatile and consequential conflict, a custody war with high moral stakes, a love triangle laced with betrayal, and the breakdown of a woman he once loved. This daring move paid off spectacularly. Rory Gibson's Michael was not timid or uncertain, he was resolute, protective, and wise beyond his years, returning not as a boy defined by his family name, but as a man determined to protect the people who mattered most. Key to this transformation was the calculated use of Jason, who operated not merely as a supporting figure but as the quiet enforcer of truth. Jason's role in extracting Amelia from Drew's care. An act initially painted as criminal by Willow and Drew, became the turning point that changed public perception. It revealed Jason not as a lawbreaker, but as the last line of defense against emotional manipulation, deceit, and the abuse of power disguised as love. Through his unwavering commitment to Michael's children, Jason became the moral measuring stick of the narrative. He didn't raise his voice or seek the spotlight, but his actions were rooted in clarity, legality, and a profound understanding of loyalty. By standing firm in the face of public scorn and confronting Willow and Drew with evidence, he quietly but effectively dismantled their narrative. And in doing so, Jason became the mirror through which the audience was forced to reevaluate Willow. Her character, once seen as the victim of circumstance and loss, was now laid bare as someone who had willingly participated in her own undoing. With every desperate outburst, every blind defense of Drew, and every legal document she had signed to place her children under Drew's control, Willow had walked further away from reason and deeper into a spiral of denial. Jason's presence didn't just expose Drew. It revealed the fragility of Willow's emotional choices, showing how far she had drifted from the woman who once inspired admiration for her strength and maternal instinct. Audiences began to shift. No longer did they see Willow as the fragile mother caught in a battle too big for her. Instead, they saw a woman lost to her own fear and ego, someone who had traded wisdom for the comfort of lies. Her actions, once excused as grief, were now framed as reckless, and her refusal to accept truth became symbolic of a deeper, more tragic flaw, the inability to separate love from control. As she clung to Drew's soft-spoken manipulations, she failed to see the damage he was doing, not only to her, but to the very children she was trying to shield. Meanwhile, Drew's behavior grew more disturbing with every passing day. He showed no remorse for the chaos he helped sow, instead, he doubled down. Appearing in courtrooms, behind closed doors, and even in public, armed with legal strategies and a carefully curated image of being Willow's protector. He continued to exploit her vulnerability, convincing her to reinforce his guardianship in legal documents and coaching her on how to paint Michael as an absent and unreliable father. But the cracks in Drew's facade were beginning to show. Jason's decision to release damning evidence of Drew's manipulation to the public. Recordings, witness testimonies, and even surveillance footage, began to turn the tide. People in Port Charles started asking questions. Allies distanced themselves. Judges raised eyebrows. What once looked like a sincere, if complicated, relationship between Drew and Willow now seemed more like a slow-motion hostage situation, with Drew pulling the strings and Willow caught in the illusion of safety. The upcoming custody hearings, which Drew had once confidently anticipated as a win, now loomed as potential ruin. His legal victories had been built on deception, and with Jason's exposure of that deceit, the foundation began to crumble. And through it all, Michael remained centered. He didn't gloat, didn't retaliate, and didn't fall into the traps laid by Drew's provocations. Instead, he focused entirely on his children. When he welcomed Amelia back into his arms, it wasn't a moment of vengeance, it was one of calm, measured love. There was no gloating in his eyes, no satisfaction in Willow's pain. There was only the resolve of a father who had finally regained what he'd been fighting for. Wiley and Amelia were not pawns to him. They were lives, hearts, futures, and he would protect them, not through manipulation, but through unwavering devotion. For Willow, that image. Michael calm, loving, and centered, surrounded by the children she had nearly lost, was the final crack in her illusion. Sitting alone in the hallway of the PCPD, away from the chaos, away from Drew, away from the storm she helped create, Willow finally had space to reflect. She felt the full weight of her decisions, the people she had pushed away, the truths she had ignored, the trust she had broken. And in that silence, she came to a painful realization. Sometimes, a person must lose everything to understand what they truly had. The lesson she was learning was brutal, but necessary. Trust must be earned, not given blindly. Love must be rooted in truth, not flattery. And motherhood, true motherhood, demands more than instinct. It demands wisdom. Whether Willow will rise from the ashes of her mistakes remains to be seen. Redemption, if it comes, will not be easy. It will require humility, sacrifice, and time. But in this moment, her fall served a greater narrative purpose. It shone a spotlight on Michael, revealing a depth of strength and clarity that audiences hadn't seen in years. In the ruins of Willow's missteps, Michael's quiet resilience and moral steadiness now stood tall, not as a man untouched by pain, but as one who transformed pain into purpose. And as General Hospital continues to unfold, it is his story, rebuilt in the fire of loss and betrayal, that now carries the weight of hope, truth, and the future of the Corinthos legacy.